Welcome back everyone. I've been away for a while and that's because I was recently finishing up my PhD thesis, but now that's all out of the way, I'm done with that, so I'll be back to making regular videos once a week from now on. In today's video I'm going to be finishing off my reviews of Anne Rice's Mayfair Witches trilogy. We're going to be looking at Taltos. Unfortunately, although I did love the first book in the trilogy, I thought the second book was still pretty good. This third book was definitely not my favourite, and I do think that the series has gone out on a little bit of a whimper. That being said, I do think there are a couple of saving graces with this book, so while this is going to be a roughly negative review, there will be some positives as well as we go. Part 1. Summary. In the previous novel, it was revealed that the spirit, Lasher, who has haunted the Mayfair witches throughout the generations, actually belongs to a different race of beings called the Taltos. In the novel, Taltos, the Mayfair witches find themselves coming into contact once again with a being who very well might be the last surviving Taltos on Earth. Part 2. In with a bang, out with a whimper. Having now completed the Mayfair Witches trilogy, I can honestly say that the first book, The Witching Hour, is one of Rice's best books, or at least one of the best that I've read so far, having read a few of the Vampire Chronicles already. But unfortunately, this book does not live up to The Witching Hour by a long shot. In fact, I might even go as far as to say that Taltos might be the worst Anne Rice book that I have read so far. But I haven't read a whole bibliography, so that's something that might change, who knows, in the future. What I liked about The Witching Hour was just how epic and sprawling it was. You had this complex, detailed family tree, going through the decades, learning about the various branches of this family tree. And every time period that Rice covered was incredibly well done, well researched, well crafted. And the connections and the story was incredibly complex and interesting. All of the characters were really well fleshed out and interesting, and although the book is around 1,000 pages, I found it gripping pretty much from start to finish. In the second novel, Lasher, Rice scales everything back a little bit. We don't really focus too much on the complex history of the Mayfair witches, instead we focus very much on the present day storyline and the mythology surrounding Lasher. And while I don't think Lasher lives up to the epicness of The Witching Hour, it's still a very good novel, and it provides a very satisfying conclusion to the Lasher storyline. Although there are certainly some signs of things dipping with certain character decisions that are made in that book that I've talked about in my review. In Taltos, it seems like all of the scaling back that Rice did in Lasher is continuing, and it's now being scaled back to a point where there's not all that much interesting left in the story. I found that the characters weren't particularly interesting, I didn't find the plot particularly interesting, and most of the tensions and important plot points were already resolved in the previous two books. Unfortunately, Mona, who I complained about in the previous novel, takes an even bigger role in this book, and she has an even more annoying companion friend called Mary Jane, who is basically the same as Mona, she's just a bit more country and southern, and that's about it when it comes to differences between these two. And even main characters like Michael, who up until this point I thought his characterization was excellent, have just become incredibly one-note and incredibly dull. The only saving grace in terms of characters for this book for me was Rowan, who makes an excellent comeback in this story, having been absent for most of the second book, and she really is the thing that kept me interested in the story throughout. Since I do have a lot of positive things to say about Rowan, I will give her her own section later, but first I'm just going to go on a bit of a rant about all the new characters and why I didn't like them very much. The problem with most of the new characters in this book is that none of them live up to the level of complexity, or none of them have the same mystique that the characters in the previous books had. And I think that Rice kind of shot her foot with this third book in a big way. The series is called The Lives of the Mayfair Witches, and in The Witching Hour, you get a sense not just of the present day Mayfair witches, but you get a sense for how they're connected to their past, and Rice does an excellent blending of past and present with the various generations of the family. But the historical Mayfairs barely feature at all in this story. And while that could have been interesting to have a story that focuses much more on the present day action, unfortunately the present day Mayfairs are just not very interesting, and the villains that Rice comes up with for this book are not very interesting either. Much of the focus of Taltos is, as the name suggests, on the Taltos, the creatures that belong to the same race as Lasher. But the Taltos by themselves aren't particularly interesting. Because Rice killed Lasher off at the end of the previous book, we've got no real connection to those people anymore. And so it just wasn't all that engaging to learn about the backstory of the Taltos. And even when Rice did get onto mythologizing, which is something she generally does quite well, it just lacked the kind of emotional connection that her mythologizing had in The Witching Hour, because in that book you have Rowan and Michael being brought together and learning about their past, and so you have this kind of connection through time. In the second book, Lasher was killed, and so we lose that connection to the Taltos. Ultimately, I just can't help but think that maybe Rice lost her steam with this series by the third book. It really seemed to me that, although the previous book did end at a very dramatic moment, that could have been a good moment to end the story. She certainly tied up most of the plot points in the previous book, except for maybe some of the mysteries surrounding the Taltos. It seemed like the only real reason for this book was to do that mythologizing around the Taltos, but Rice just didn't come up with a compelling story to tell around that mythology. She did that really well in The Witching Hour, she did it reasonably well in Lasher, but in this book, there's just no compelling story here. I think perhaps though there is a good reason for Rice writing this book. One big theme in Rice's work generally is humanizing monsters. And in The Witching Hour so far, we've had our monster, Lasher, who is a Taltos, and he's been the main villain. And Lasher isn't a very sympathetic character. And so perhaps it seemed like maybe Rice wanted to have a book where she explored the Taltos and humanized them and made them seem to be, you know, human beings just like us. And while that's a noble message and I like it, it's just a shame that there wasn't a particularly interesting story being told here. Part 2. A Saving Grace, Rowan Mayfair. Okay, so I've ranted enough about negative things, let's talk about something that I did like, and that is Rowan Mayfair. I was a bit worried when I started reading the book, because when Rowan appears, she is once again in a vegetative state, and so I was like, okay, are we going to have another situation where Rowan, the interesting character, is just absent for a whole book again? But thankfully, Rice didn't do that. Rowan came out of that state, and then she took an active role, a big active role, in the story from that point on. That being said, the reasons surrounding Rowan's awakening are pretty dire, since Rice decides to unceremoniously kill a character who I won't name off screen just before Rowan wakes up, and that's what wakes her up. And just before I get to the good stuff, I will also say that that was also something that I didn't like with the story, because I think killing off a character off screen in a book that is, you know, severely lacking in good characters already is not a good idea. But we'll leave that, and we can talk about that in the comments if you've read the book. But now back to Rowan. The reason why I think Rowan is the saving grace for this book is because Rowan is the only character at this point who shows consistent growth throughout the entire trilogy. In The Witching Hour, we have this headstrong, successful doctor who's very secure and sure of herself. She then discovers this family tree, she gets embroiled with the Lasher stuff, and she essentially has a fall from grace. In the second book, she's mostly absent, but she does have that very dramatic comeback at the end, which is great. And in the third book, we have her dealing with the repercussions of the decisions that she's made. Those decisions involve choosing Lasher over Michael, and the abuses that she suffered at Lasher's hands, and her pregnancy, and then her killing her own daughter at the end of the previous book. By this point, Rowan is a far cry from the successful professional doctor that she was when we met her in the first book. And that makes her very interesting. She's gone through shifts in her personality as the story's gone by, and she's developing constantly. Whereas the other characters are very stagnant. Michael is still just this stoical hard man. Mona is still just an irritating sex maniac 12-year-old or 13-year-old, however old she is, it's disgusting. Anyway, but Rowan is a character who has changed, has grown and developed. There was also something that I noticed about Rowan's characterization and how it compares with Michael that really came to the fore in this book. Rice is a writer who often subverts gender in her stories, especially with her vampires. They're incredibly androgynous. The male ones tend to be quite feminine, the female ones can be quite masculine at times. And that's actually something that has come across in the Mayfair Witches, especially in the dynamic between Rowan and Michael. In this book, I really feel like Rowan is embodying this Byronic hero type. She's brooding, she's dark, she's psychologically tortured. She's doing the right thing, but not necessarily because it's the right thing at this point. She just needs to deal with her own inner turmoil. Whereas Michael is not so much a damsel in distress, but he's certainly the co-pilot in this case. First of all, Rowan tries to exclude him from coming with her to investigate the Talamasca and the Taltos. He does come along though. And that's usually something that happens the other way around. It's usually the big masculine hero that goes out and the woman wants to come, but he says, no, you'll stay behind. And it was interesting that that dynamic in this book shifted, and it was something that I noticed and did enjoy about the story. Although, unfortunately, just as in classical texts when you have that dynamic, the person who plays the more passive role tends to be quite dull in characterization. Likewise, Michael was also pretty dull in his characterization here. Part 3, the Taltos. And so we're reading an Anne Rice novel, and what do you always get in an Anne Rice novel? You get a digression that goes on for about 100 or 200 pages, or sometimes the entire book, where a character will tell you about their backstory for a while. In Taltos we have that backstory, and it's the backstory of the Taltos. And this book is basically just about that. The whole reason that we're here, the whole reason why we're going through this story is so that Rice can tell us about the Taltos. Is the mythology interesting? Yes, actually it is interesting. The actual story that tells us the history of the Taltos is gripping. It's interesting to see the ways in which the Taltos evolved over time and how they interacted with human beings. And Rice certainly satisfies her goal of humanizing the Taltos. Unfortunately, and I have alluded to this already, you can't just have a story that has a great mythology. You also have to tell an interesting story around that mythology, and with this book, that just didn't happen, or at least for me, that didn't happen. And what makes this worse is that I do think it would have been quite easy for Rice to have told a slightly different story that would have made that backstory and that mythology way more gripping, way more interesting, because it would have been told in the context of a very interesting story. So at the end of Lasher, we learn that there is corruption occurring in the Talamasca. And this is one of the big mysteries at the end of the story, because we don't know the extent of this corruption. And it's the corruption of the Talamasca that causes Rowan to go on her quest, if you like, in this story. And so it's a big part of the book. And unfortunately, the resolution of this happens really quickly. It's just a few little rebels. It's no big, interesting, political intrigue type story. It just gets dealt with reasonably easy. And the villains who are involved in the plot are just your stock villains. They're not particularly interesting, not anything to write home about in terms of characterization. And that makes it even worse. Rice really set herself up with Lasher for there to be something really interesting with the Talamasca here, and it just wasn't taken up in this story. Which is a shame, because you could have told a story about the Taltos that are alive and the Talamasca having a feud and the Mayfair witches getting embroiled in this, and that's why we would care about the Taltos and helping them. But unfortunately, Rice didn't really go there with the corruption in the Talamasca. Another issue that I have with the Taltos as a race is that what made them interesting was Lasher. And what we learned in the second book is that Lasher isn't really all that aware of who the Taltos are and their history. And so it was a bit of a shame that Rice decided, given that she wanted to write a third book, to kill Lasher off. Because it could have been very interesting to have had Lasher himself explore his origins, see where he has come from, and then see how he reacts to that history and how that changes the way that he deals with the Mayfair witches. I think that, having Lasher around and connecting to that history, would have been way more interesting than killing him off and then just creating new Taltos that we, don't really know that much about, because they're not very well characterized. And even if Rice did want to kill Taltos off in the second book, just to deal with him as a villain, she did have Emeleth, the daughter, in the second book. It would have been way more emotionally impactful for Emeleth to come into this world and to learn about the Taltos, and then to make a choice either between the Taltos and the humans, or something in between. That could have been really interesting. But again, Emeleth was bumped off, shot in the head, and although I do think that was a fantastic scene, I do think if you want to create a third novel that's based around these creatures, killing off the creatures that we've been introduced to in the previous books that are our connection to that race seems to be a bit of a poor move. It might have also given Michael something to do, because if Emeleth was around, he'd have to deal with the fact that, Rowan and Lasher's love child is still there, and so that might have created some interesting relationship dynamics for him and Rowan. So overall, Taltos, very interesting backstory, just unfortunately wasn't a particularly interesting story surrounded that, and so I did find it hard to really care about this mythology. Especially because I do think there were some ways that Rice maybe could have told an interesting story around the Taltos to have made that mythology all the more interesting and compelling. Part 4, conclusion. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that for me, Taltos was a poor way to end the Mayfair Witches trilogy. Fortunately though, I do think that The Witching Hour and Lasher, the first two books, do actually work together quite well, and so I probably would read these two books again and just not read the third one again. The main reasons why I don't think Taltos works is that Taltos just has no compelling plot to speak of. And while plot isn't always something that Rice focuses on, her books can be quite character-based, unfortunately with Taltos, it's also lacking in characters, and so you don't have the characters and the interest and the backstories to depend upon here. There's not a particularly good plot. The characters don't really develop or go anywhere. And unfortunately, Mona is still here in the story. And I suppose I could have a whole section where I complain about Mona and why she is just a terrible, terrible character. But I won't do that. I will leave you to read it and make up your own minds about Mona, and talk to me about her in the comments if you like as well. The two saving graces, though, of Taltos are firstly the Taltos backstory. It is interesting, it is compelling, and if you just take it on its own, it's kind of an interesting filler for some of the mysteries in the previous books. Also, Rowan, it was great to have her back in this book. Her psychological struggles with what she's been through were the most interesting part of the book, and it was kind of a shame that we didn't actually spend more time just focusing on that psychological trauma, because it was certainly one of the most interesting parts, not just of this book, but of the whole series. Alright, that's it for this video. This has been probably my most negative review on this channel so far. I don't tend to like doing negative reviews, but when I'm doing a series, I feel like I have to do a negative review, because I don't want to not complete the series. So here you are, a very negative review from me, although I do think there are a couple of good things about the book. I would certainly like to hear what your thoughts though. It does seem like I am agreeing with the general consensus that The Witching Hour is great, Lasher is okay, and Taltos is terrible. But if you think differently, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and have a bit of discussion about that. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for updates for new videos. Now that I'm done with my academic work, I'll be back posting weekly videos on Mondays at 4 PM. That's it for me now though, so take care everyone. I'll see you all in the next video.